engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
advances,
Questions. Research.
technology. Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientist. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientist, the show where we bring you the latest breakthroughs in science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith. And following the news, we'll be talking about cancer, but not the type you might expect.
There are quite a number of examples of cancers spreading. These are all extremely tragic and sad, rare cases, but they can happen from time to time.
These are cancers that defy what we understand about biology. They can jump from one animal to another. But how do they do that? And could this ever happen in humans?
The Naked Scientist podcast is powered by ukfast.co.uk.
You're listening to The Naked Scientist with me, Chris Smith, and in this half of the programme we're going to be talking about cancers that can spread not just within a body, but from one individual to another. Now, cancers are made from a person's own cells going rogue. If a cell acquires the right combinations of mutations or changes in its genetic code, it can divide uncontrollably and lead to the formation of a tumour. As these cells contain a unique individual's DNA, if they end up in another individual's body, it should sound the immune alarm, just like an incompatible organ transplant. They should be recognised as foreign and destroyed. Now, some viruses, which are of course also infectious, like the human papillomavirus or HPV, can also cause cancer, but this is because they can trigger changes in a cell's genetic code that leads to tumour formation. And in these sorts of cases, the virus is infectious rather than the cancer itself. In the very rare instances of contagious cancers, though, it's the cancer cells themselves that are passing from one individual to another. And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring this week. To emphasise, these cancers haven't been observed naturally yet in humans, but they have been spotted in other animals. And one animal that's experiencing a rare cancer outbreak are Australia's Tasmanian devils. This disease, which only appeared for the first time in recent decades, has pushed the species to the brink of extinction. Threatened species keeper Ben from the Healesville Sanctuary at Zoos Victoria in Australia explains how they're helping to save the Tasmanian devil to Julia Ravey during, well, I suppose you could call it feeding time at the zoo.
So today we're going to feed some of our Tassie devils. All of our food is labelled with little tags so we know whose food is whose, because everyone has a little bit different weights. So we're doing a scatter feed here, so we throw food throughout their habitat. We spread it around so that they have to go forage for it. Some of the devils over here are pretty shy. Tasmanian devils don't really truly follow their name, and they're actually very timid by nature. Tassie devils are threatened species. So with some of our breeding females that we're hoping to breed this season, we've got camera footage monitoring them feeding. So we just make sure that's turned on every night, and we check that every day just to see if the females have eaten overnight. And the main reason we need to check this is because if they're going through estrus, they don't eat their food as often or as frequently as normal. And that way we can tell that they are going through their estrus and we can start to prepare for breeding.
Sanctuaries like the Healesville Sanctuary, supported by Zoos Victoria in Australia, are playing a vital role in helping the Tasmanian devil avoid extinction through their breeding programs. These animals are also being released into the wild on islands and mainland Australia to up their numbers. This is because their numbered sightings have dropped by 80% in the last 2 decades, and as Ben said, they are officially an endangered species. Hannah Siddle, an assistant professor in molecular immunology from the University of Southampton, explains what has caused this drastic decline.
So the majority of the decline has been caused by what we call DFT1, which is devil facial tumour disease. And that is the tumour that emerged sometime just before 1995. We do now have a second contagious cancer in the Tasmanian devil population termed DFT2. And it is now responsible for some declines, but in a very limited geographic area where it's still located.
And you say this is a contagious cancer. So how does it spread from one animal to another?
It's a little bit like, for us, a virus or bacteria, because it can pass when the devils contact each other. Rather than being a virally induced tumour, this is actually the cancer cells themselves that are able to pass between individuals. And we think in the case of the Tasmanian devils that this is primarily occurring when they bite each other, which unfortunately they do tend to do when they're fighting and in the mating season as well. Our best evidence at the moment is that these cells are actually grafting into the next devil when this biting behaviour occurs. And once these tumour cells then seed into the next individual, they grow and establish and make a new tumour, which can then be passed on to the next individual.
That's rare, isn't it? Because cancer is made up of a unique individual's cells that have gone rogue in a way. So what is it, do you think, that makes this cancer able to transmit in a population?
We think that these tumours are taking advantage of the fact that although genetic diversity is not so low that these animals are clonal or exactly the same, they do have a lower level of genetic diversity than in populations that have more healthy numbers. We do think that these tumours may be taking advantage of this fact, and that may be allowing them to initially start to spread between a few individuals. After that, though, the idea that there is not enough genetic diversity in the population, and so this is allowing the tumour to take hold, that idea breaks down a little bit, because we do have some genetic diversity and enough genetic diversity in the population to stop the tumour spreading. But tumours are very good at acquiring new mutations, and they adapt, of course. They adapt to their environment. And so they will acquire adaptations that are then helping them to then passage between individuals. And we have found that one of the adaptations that they have made, these tumours, is to lose some of the proteins, or what we call antigens, on the cell surface of the tumours that are usually a flag for the immune system and would stop the tumour from transferring between individuals. This adaptation then allows the tumours to essentially become silent or invisible in the population.
Are the cells in this tumour the same in every individual infected?
Essentially, yes. So when we say they're the same, they all have derived from a single ancestral tumour cell, which is a cell in a Tasmanian devil that became malignant a long time ago. The tumours that are currently circulating in the Tasmanian devil will be slightly different to what they were when that tumour first arose and started transferring, because they've acquired new genetic mutations, new adaptations to their environment.
You mentioned that there are 2 of these contagious cancers in Tasmanian devils. So what's happened there? Is this the same disease, but it's just a really mutated version, or is it something new entirely?
It is something new entirely, in that it arose in a completely independent manner from a different individual, this second tumour. Really, really unusual to have that occur. And actually, this is the only mammalian species where we know that that's occurred. We think that the second tumour arose sometime around 2014. And interestingly, we think we've been tracing this from nearly the beginning of its genesis. There is a lot of effort going into trapping Tasmanian devils in the geographic location of DFT2, which is in the southeast of Tasmania, and it's quite confined at the moment. Although recent efforts have shown that it is moving northwards, and so it is starting to spread, unfortunately, and become more prevalent.
It seems like an unusual phenomenon for this to happen twice in one species. Is this a case of lightning striking twice in the same place? Or are these animals, do you think, just susceptible to these types of conditions?
I think it probably is lightning striking twice, as you say, but I think we need to probably be more aware in wildlife generally. Possibly these tumours are arising at different times, but that they don't have the success that DFT1 and DFT2 have had in the population. So I think it's probably likely that these tumours do arise sometimes.
With communicable diseases in humans, we aim to treat them. We aim to develop vaccinations or other medical treatments. Is anything in the line like that for Tasmanian devils? Will there be a vaccine for these tumours, do you think?
Transmissible tumours should be not easy to vaccinate against, but they should present some sort of routes for vaccination. And certainly we've been able to show that if we can restore some of these antigens that I was talking about before that usually coat the tumour cells, then if you put those into a Tasmanian devil or in a co-culture situation, which is what we call this, then we can actually see an immune response against these antigens on the tumour cells. So that tells us that the Tasmanian devil immune system is capable of responding. But unfortunately, it does seem as if this type of vaccine with these antigens on the surface of the tumour cells, it does work in some animals, but it doesn't seem to work in 100% of animals. And we're not quite sure what the efficacy of that is and why it doesn't work in some instances. So I think we need to do just a bit more work to understand what it is that the immune system responds to and whether then we could make a more targeted vaccine based on that information.
Let's hope they can. Hannah Siddle there from the University of Southampton. Now, Tasmanian devils, as we've just been hearing, are one mammal that experiences these transmissible tumours. But another animal, probably one that's even more familiar to you, is one that we all know and love. It's our best friend, and that's dogs. They're also victims of a contagious cancer. And here to tell us more about that one is Elizabeth Murchison from the Transmissible Cancers Group at the University of Cambridge. Tell us first, what is this transmissible tumour in dogs and how does it spread?
Dog transmissible cancer is quite different to the one in Tasmanian devils. It's also spread between animals by the transfer of living cancer cells themselves. But in this case, the cells are spread during mating, and this results in genital tumours. It's actually very, very common, although most people in the UK probably haven't heard of it. And that's because its main reservoir is free-roaming, sexually active, uncontrolled dog populations. And as we know, they don't occur in the UK anymore. But actually, interestingly, this disease was first described in the scientific literature in the UK 200 years ago in London. So we know it was common here once, but it disappeared in the 20th century due to the control of dogs.
And what fraction of dogs worldwide have got it then?
It's extraordinary. About 1% of dogs worldwide in places where this is endemic, which is most places, have this disease. So it's extraordinarily common. It's quite shocking to think how many dogs have this disease. But it's different to the Tasmanian devil cancer in that it's not nearly as deadly. Dogs with this disease, they tend to have localized tumours which remain in the external genitalia. They don't metastasize or spread to other parts of the body that frequently. And also the other wonderful thing is that this disease is highly curable with a course of simple chemotherapy. Most of these dogs, almost 100% of them, will undergo a complete cure. And we think that that's actually something to do with the immune system rather than to do with the way that chemotherapy drugs act per se.
Hannah Siddle was telling us about the Tasmanian devils that there's evidence that in each case, because there were two diseases, they've originated from one individual. Is the same true with the dog tumour then?
Exactly, and that's the really fascinating thing about this dog cancer, that all the tumours and all of these dogs all around the world, they all carry the cells of one individual dog that first gave rise to this cancer. Extraordinarily, we think that that one dog lived about 6,000 years ago, and that dog was a dog which got a cancer. Rather than that cancer dying together with its dog host, as most cancers do, those cancer cells spread to another host, and from there that one single cancer lineage has survived for thousands of years and has spread all around the world. And it's by far the most prolific and widespread cancer that we know of in nature. It's really a really remarkable phenomenon.
How do you know it's 6,000 years old?
Well, that's an estimate, and it's based on counting mutations in the genome of this cancer. So as cancer cells, or actually indeed any cell, divides, it will accumulate mutations with time. So what we've been able to do is estimate how quickly cells of this dog cancer accumulate mutations, and we've done that by collecting tumours where we know the tumour was spread from one dog to another dog, and we know when that happened. So by counting the number of mutations in these short intervals, we've been able to estimate how many mutations occur per unit time. And then by counting the number of mutations back to that original dog and applying this mutation rate, we've been able to come up with this estimate, which does have huge error associated with it. So we think around 6,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years.
Why do you think that the Tasmanian devil tumour is a disaster for them? But in dogs, as you've pointed out, it's eminently treatable and much more mild as a disease.
Well, this is an interesting question because it does make you wonder whether thousands of years of evolution have potentially caused this dog cancer to adapt to being a less aggressive cancer. Because if you think about it, a cancer which comes in and kills its host is going to limit its own possibilities for onward transmission, whereas a cancer that comes in and causes a fairly mild disease, lives alongside its host for potentially years, has many more transmission opportunities. So although we can't time travel back to that original cancer that first arose from that dog several thousand years ago to see whether it was actually more aggressive, it's a really interesting possibility that this cancer may have adapted to being less deadly.
Absolutely fascinating. We'll leave it there for now. Stay with us though, please, Elizabeth. We'll hear more from you a bit later on in the programme about these sorts of cancers more generally. You're listening to The Naked Scientist with me, Chris Smith. We are going to leave the world of mammals behind us a bit now. We'll come back to them when we talk to Elizabeth again in a minute. But we're going to talk now about this sort of transfer also occurring in animals called bivalves. These are shellfish because, believe it or not, they also get transmissible tumours, and they include animals like mussels, clams and cockles. But before we talk about those cancers, Rob Ellis, who's a researcher in ecophysiology and sustainable aquaculture at the University of Exeter, has gone down to his local estuary to celebrate the wonders of these organisms.
So actually I'm today out on the Exe estuary in East Devon, and in this estuary bivalves play a critical role for biodiversity. So we have a number of different bivalve populations. Probably most visibly noticeable are those of the mussels and the oysters. So these two species are classed as ecosystem engineers. The two organisms, when they settle, create a natural reef. Now, in doing so, they create a novel habitat that's able to support a range of other species. If we think about a region, for example, the southwest of England, the number of species supported by bivalve reefs can go up to around 750. As well as improving biodiversity, bivalves obviously play a really important role as a food source for things like crabs, starfish, and other benthic predators. And actually, they are really important in terms of a food source for humans. So around 3 miles off the coast of East Devon, it's a bit of a cloudy day today, so I can't quite see it. But we've got the largest mussel farm in the UK, offshore shellfish, called Mussels of Readily Filter Feedings. The population of mussels or a mussel bed can actually improve water clarity and therefore really benefit adjacent habitats such as seagrass beds and associated species like that. They can be a really powerful tool that we can employ to therefore improve those coastal environments and reduce human impact. If we were to lose bivalves, this would be a really important problem in terms of impacting coastal biodiversity, impacting coastal function, ecosystem function, and also in terms of impacting our ability to utilise those resources as a source of human food as well.
Based on those insights from Rob, losing bivalves would be pretty disastrous. But these animals are also impacted by contagious cancers. These diseases have only recently been found in bivalves, but could have driven past declines in numbers. Alicia Brutos, cancer researcher at the Francis Crick Institute, who studies these rare conditions in bivalves, explains.
These cancers, which is a leukemia-like cancers in bivalves, were reported in the late 60s and in the 70s and 80s of last century. But it was not till 2015 when they were discovered that they were contagious, because we needed to analyze the DNA to know that that cancer cell did not originate in that individual and come from a different individual.
And do we have any idea about how it spreads from one organism to the next?
The hypothesis is that somehow the cell is released to the environment. We don't know if it is an active release or if it is when he's dying passively, the cells are released to the environment. Then the cells float in the seawater and they survive in that seawater. So maybe the temperature and the salinity and all these conditions might have an impact. And finally, these bivalves, what they usually do in nature is that they filter water. Probably by filtering water, they take some cancer cells that were floating in the water. And those cancer cells go inside and then they start to develop.
Mammals' immune systems have evolved in a way to detect things that are foreign and get rid of it. But I'm guessing the immune system of bivalves is quite different to immune systems like ours. So is there a flaw in their immune system that allows this type of contagious cancer?
We do know they have defense, but they don't have the same immune system as us. So a lot of research has to be done to actually understand why they are not as successful as our immune system to defend themselves from contagious cancers. There are many parasites that are affecting these kind of animals, the bivalves. So a lot of research is being done to try to understand why is this happening? I mean, why is not the immune system of these animals fighting against all these parasites and, of course, as well, the contagious cancers?
You said that these cells appear to float in the water, passing from one organism into the other. How far do we think these cells can travel?
Earlier this year, it was published that a cancer, the same cancer, was found in some clams in the Atlantic coast of Spain and also in the Mediterranean coast of Spain. And those two places are located more than 1,000 miles away. So how is this possible? Was the cancer cell, able to float and travel that far? We are not sure. We also have to consider that maybe human activity played a role in moving that cancer from the Atlantic coast to the Mediterranean coast. But for instance, in mussels, another type of contagious cancer, it has been found in Chile, South America, in North America, in Europe, and even in Russia. But in the case of mussels attach to the boats, and boats travel long distances. So by moving the mussels from one area to another, that is probably how this contagious cancer was arriving to so many places in the world. But yeah, in the case of the clams that usually live buried in the sand, so they don't attach to the boats, it's a very interesting question as well.
And with these cancers, are they restricted to an individual species in the sense of if a cancer arises in one species, does it stay within that species because they're genetically similar, or can it sort of jump the species barrier and move into another?
For most of them, it is how you describe it. So the cancer arises in an animal and it spreads to other individuals of the same species. But surprisingly, there are several cases in bivalves where the cancer arose in one bivalve species, and nowadays it is found in other species. By reading the DNA, you are able to study the history of that cancer. We found a cancer in the Wartivinus clam, which is a clam that lives in both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of Spain. By studying the DNA, we find out that the cancer cell did not arise in the Wartivinus clam, but arose in a different species, which was called the striped Venus clam. And another case of cancer that crossed that species barrier is the mussels. And this one is very interesting because it has gone not only for Mytilus trossulus, it is also infecting 3 extra additional species. That is like the master of cancer.
So it seems like we have these cancers that can not only spread from organism to organism, but they can spread potentially from species to maybe different species, and then also can potentially travel in some way we don't know and spread from population to population. So what would this mean if these types of cancers impacted lots of bivalve populations? What would be the impact of that?
We should be very careful with our economic activities when moving animals from one place to another. And not only animals, even with the seawater. We should now think on cancer like a parasite. In the case of contagious cancer, it does behave as a parasite and try to track at least these movements so we don't put the disease into a disease-free area. Because imagine that these cancers become very aggressive and they reduce potentially the number of individuals and they drive it to extinction. That will be an ecological problem. But if we keep the disease-free areas being a disease-free area, so no cancer goes into there, at least not by our activities, in a scenario where this happens, that all the population reduces, we can repopulate with those ones that didn't have the disease.
Well, that would be a relief. Fascinating stuff, isn't it? Julia was talking with Alicia Bruos from the Francis Crick Institute down in London. Now, so far, cases of contagious cancers have only been documented in these three animal types: Tasmanian devils, dogs, and the shellfish that we were just hearing about. But we can still learn a lot about cancer biology in general from cases like these and question whether these could arise elsewhere, for instance, in us. Now, Elizabeth Murchison is still with us, and let's pick up where we left off when we were talking about the transmissible tumours in dogs, Elizabeth. What can we learn by studying how these cancers do what they do to inform our knowledge of cancer biology more generally?
Well, one thing about contagious cancers is that they frequently live much longer than cancers that just arise and remain within a single individual. And that means that we can study cancer's long-term evolution, and that can tell us how cancers can continue to adapt to their hosts. And this can give us insights into the optimal evolutionary routes that cancers can take. But also they can tell us about how cancers can adapt to escape the immune system under fairly extreme circumstances. So cancers often adapt to escape the immune system even when they're only non-transmissible cancers just arising and staying within their host. But these transmissible cancers have to escape what we call an allogeneic immune system, an immune system of a different individual, a foreign graft in essence. And this very extreme setting, insights into that can tell us more about how cancers escape the immune system even when they stay in the same host.
In recent years, we've discovered that cancers also team up with the microbes in the body. And in fact, just this week, there was a paper out that looked at the presence of microorganisms inside cancer cells, endowing those cancer cells with additional abilities, such as greater resilience, so they can spread around the body better. Has anyone looked at these transmissible tumours and asked if there are bacterial passengers in them that might be aiding and abetting their spread?
That's a fascinating question, and that's actually something that we're currently looking at, although we don't have anything conclusive to say yet. One thing that is really interesting in the dog cancer, however, is that it sometimes takes up little pieces of DNA called mitochondrial DNA from its hosts. And so as it's spread along, it's sometimes stolen mitochondrial DNA from its host, which helps it to adapt better to being a cancer. And this might also be a mechanism which might occur from time to time in human cancers.
And speaking of human cancers, has this actually happened? I know I reassured people by saying that there's no defined equivalent to these cancers that's spreading among humans all the time at the moment, but are there isolated examples of this happening?
Yeah, there are quite a number of examples of cancers spreading between two people or between small groups of people, and these usually occur in three different types of settings. So first of all, there are kind of accidents, such as surgical accidents, for instance. And there's one very terrifying case of a surgeon who was operating on a cancer patient and accidentally cut himself on the hand. And then several months later, he discovered a cancer in his hand at the surgical injury site, and it turned out to be the cells of the patient, although he was cured. And then there are organ transplants. So when organ transplants are performed, there are very stringent screening processes in place to prevent accidental transfer of cancer cells. But unfortunately, this has happened from time to time, and cancers have then manifested in the organ recipient. And then the final case is during pregnancy, and this is usually a cancer from a pregnant mother can spread to the fetus. This is extraordinarily rare and usually involves leukemia or lymphoma. These are all extremely tragic and sad, rare cases, but they can happen from time to time.
I wanted to touch on that point you raised about pregnancy because, of course, that is the body tolerating the invasive growth of tissue, which is genetically incompatible to it. The baby is genetically different from mum. So is there evidence that these transmissible cancers in the animals that get them are actually exploiting that mechanism that is a necessity of the way we reproduce?
It could well be that transmissible cancers are making use of some of the adaptations that are there in our cells, which allow pregnancy to occur, which, as you said, is a circumstance when two genetically distinct cell types coexist within the same body. So there is some preliminary evidence suggesting that that could well be the case, that some of these pregnancy mechanisms are being used.
Elizabeth Murchison from the Transmissible Cancers Group at the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much indeed. So overall, in very rare instances, under specific conditions, cancers can spread from one organism to another. Now, exactly how this happens is still unclear, but it looks like the key is that the cancer can hide itself away from the immune system, maybe by removing markers from its surface so it can fly under the immune radar, or making changes to its genetic code that allow it to in some way reprogram the host's immunity. Understanding the distinction between what makes a cancer transmissible or not could help to save species like the Tasmanian devil from extinction, as well as protecting our marine ecosystems. And although very unlikely to cause outbreaks like we see with viruses amongst us humans, thanks to our immune systems being very good at destroying foreign cells, better understanding these conditions can show us how cancer spread in our own bodies and prevent the rare instances of cancer passing on via processes like transplantation. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith. Thanks for listening. And until next time, goodbye.